Hi all, and sorry for the quality of the video as usual. We still haven't figured out how to make this a little more professional, and I do apologize for not having my hat on. I cut my own hair, so that's not really a big deal, but my husband and I were talking about it, and he said, I think you could cover all your bald spots if you just sort of like do comb overs. So I apologize for the Dame Judi Dench haircut I have at the moment, but it's more a matter of it growing in, and I think I've covered all the bald spots, but you know how it is. We're all a little bit vain somewhere in our hearts. So anyway, here we are. And I wanted to continue that video from 2 days ago that I promised you. And I believe that I had covered the Enlightenment all the way up to approximately Perlman. And I was going to continue on in the modern era. And I was going to start with what we call the new rhetoric, which of course is kind of Perlman for the most part. So I thought I'd go back to that. So the new rhetoric, of course, is the old rhetoric, as I said in a previous video. The new rhetoric looks very much like Aristotelian rhetoric looks. It's about argument, it's about structure, it's about clean lines and very functional sort of things. So if you've ever seen modern architecture, usually nowadays they refer to it as mid-century modern. Mid-century modern is clean lines and sort of straight edges and very functional and nothing superfluous or nothing that's overly eloquent in its appearance. The aesthetic is very sort of uncomfortable in my mind, but a lot of people like it. I actually just was working with a friend of mine on her living room that is post mid-century modern, excuse me. So, it's very much clean lines, functional approach, clean models, a progression, linear. You can sort of predict what's going to come next. And the people at this time sort of, or of this paradigm, viewed rhetoric the same way, that it could be easily evaluated by plugging it into some sort of model or something and then coming out with an answer at the end. In fact, a lot of rhetorical criticism got criticism because of that. We think that the author, the rhetorician who's evaluating the rhetor and the rhetor's speech, that somehow we know exactly what that interpretation should be. And of course, that's not the argument. The argument is that we put forth a certain criticism, a certain interpretation, a certain way of looking at things, and then we have to make an argument for why we believe that to be true, and then people accept it or reject it. Well, that wasn't working for a lot of people, and thus the postmodern influence came into the study of literature and rhetoric, and I'll get to that in a little bit. So Perlman introduces us to this idea of the new rhetoric, which has a focus on argument again and has a focus on language. And at this time, we have two other philosophers come along. One is I.A. Richards. Now, I.A. Richards actually did come up with a model, but he was not interested in communication. He was interested in miscommunication. How is it that we screw it up? And so he came out with what was known as the semantic triangle of meaning. And I'll let you look at that. I think it's in your book. If not, if you type in semantic triangle of meaning into Google, you'll see it. I don't have an image to just share with you right at this moment. I could draw one, but that would be awkward. So I just want to let you know that it's out there and it exists. And essentially the 3 points of that triangle are the symbol, which is also known as the word. And then you have the referent, which is the object to which you refer. And then you have the reference, which is the thought that you associate with that word. So when I say the word dog, think about that for a second. What do you think of? And if you didn't think of a 76-pound Collie Dalmatian Labrador, Collie Dalmatian Labrador, yeah, that's what he was, mix named Corky, who stood about this tall and had about had a collie nose and collie colors, that brown that goes into the black, and then the white diamonds under his, the beard, and then the diamond on the back, and then on his paws and on his tail, and then had boxed Labrador ears, and had the Dalmatian body, so he had that really high-end back, and then wherever he had white, he had brown Dalmatian spots. So if you didn't think of that, then you didn't think of exactly what it was I was trying to convey. Now, that, of course, is an insane way to think that we could communicate, because we know we don't just like put a bubble up in our head and we both have that same exact idea. So what he tried to do was look at that relationship between those three things, and which one of those are the most solid. Well, I know exactly what I mean when I use a symbol. I know what I'm referring to. I know what my reference is. You know what your reference is. So that link is solid. Now, the object that I'm referring to has this word, like the relationship between the object and the reference also stirs up in us the same exact thing that the symbol does. So where's the disconnect? And that's obviously between the symbol and the thing to which you refer. Now, this is harder to understand. When I say dog, you're like, oh, well, I know what that means. Unfortunately, no, we don't know exactly what we mean, but we're close enough, right? But what happens when we start using more abstract, less concrete words like love or justice or peace? That don't have like that thing that we can point to and say, there's the dog. And I do have pictures if you ever need to see them. So like, what do we do when they're more abstract terms? So I.A. Richards said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a language for actually the English language for other people, that is non-English speaking people. And we're going to get it down to 800 words. I think it was 800 words. They have this in your book. And then he said, if you are a creative writer, you get more words than that. I don't remember exactly how many words you get, but there was this like certain amount of your words that you could use. This reminds me greatly of what John Locke said when he said, look, we've got these 4 problems with language that it doesn't represent what it's supposed to, because there's no natural relationship, that words can't capture the complexity of certain things, that some words mean 5,000 things and some things have 5,000 words that associate with them. I mean, just like this idea that what we need to do, and according to John Locke, he said we need to purify the language. And by purify, he meant find all those things that we agree on and leave them there. And back in my day, my early days, the word ain't was not in the dictionary, but neither was faux shizzle, whatever that word is. Bling was not in there except to mean the sound a telephone makes. So there's a lot of sort of different changes that have happened over time that are contextual based, they're cultural based. And so this idea that we could somehow purify the language down to one thing, who decides what those things are? Well, John Locke believed that white educated free men could do that. And I.A. Richards was kind of sort of in that same position. Now, they never outright said that, but they were really talking about the academy dictating to people what words were appropriate and which words weren't, which is why the less educated people were, the less taste they were said to have, or the less refined that they sounded. And so that if you don't sound educated, that's because you don't have the words that you were supposed to be taught to use. For example, if you use the word ain't, you sounded uneducated, at least as according to my grandmother. And that would be true if the word ain't was not a generally accepted word. Now, I still dislike it, but that's because I was trained that way, right? So we all are trained in a certain way. It doesn't bother me when people say it. I think you're an uneducated fool. It's more just like it triggers something in my head, and I go, oh, okay, I'm going to get over that. So, by the way, never use that in a paper. No contractions in papers, please, of any kind, whether it's ain't or anything else. So I'm not a big fan of contractions in papers, because they also were something that was rejected by Perlman and by Locke and by others. Now, I'm not saying I'm an elitist here. I'm just saying preference for a paper. Now, everyday conversation, heck yeah, drop those G's, can't. Or as I say to people all the time, don't use contractions in your papers, because the everyday conversation is not the same as the formal presentation for a public speaker or for an academic writing. So Perlman and Locke really seem to be in sync here about what the problem is in the miscommunication between human beings. All right, so who else comes along at this time is someone who was rejected in Germany, Stephen Toulmin. He was a mathematician, and he really did not want, or he was really rejected by the philosophers, the continental philosophers, because he wanted to find a way to sort of mathematically map out an argument. How could you successfully have an argument? And by that, I mean produce the claim and support it properly so that it's a successful argument. And he couldn't get around this idea that, you can't mathematize that. I don't know if mathematize is even a word, but you can't mathematize, you can't math rhetoric, right? And certainly the way he was presenting it, you couldn't philosophize math. You could theorize about math, but you couldn't philosophize it and turn it into a moral argument or moral reasoning. And of course, Toulmin, much like Whately, much like George Campbell, there we go. Toulmin, much like George Campbell, said, that rhetoric is for that moral public reasoning that we have to do. How does the public come to moral reasoning? Now, Toulmin had it harder than George Campbell did, because George Campbell was writing as a church authority, and he was writing for a group of people who generally followed the rules. But for Toulmin, he came in, I think he died in 2007, or maybe it was 2011. It was recent in my mind, because I know most of you are like, I wasn't even driving then, but it was recent enough that, I was teaching at Missouri State at the time, and I remember saying, damn it, I really wanted to go take his class out in California where he was teaching at the time, and I never got that opportunity. And I was very upset with myself for not going. I mean, the dude was like 85 or something. I should have thought sooner, I guess is how that works. So anyway, Stephen Toulmin was a little more contemporary and had to fight back with the postmodernists that we'll get to, and fight back against people who rejected this linear way of thinking, because this linear way of thinking was also considered paternalistic, and it was considered dictatorial. Whereas other people have said, look, that's great that you made a model for argument, but you can only use it in hindsight and say, well, here's where the argument failed. Okay, well, that seems useful to me, that I can learn from what failed and what didn't. And honestly, it was kind of nice to have a language to talk about argument in some way other than ethos, logos, pathos. I've been around kids, I'm sorry. So, it was kind of nice to have that formula. What is the formula? I'm sure I don't need to repeat it to you. It's in your book. They even give you the little map for it. Those 6 parts, the 3 main parts being claim, data, and warrant, of course, and then the subparts, which I say subparts not because they're not important. I say subparts because they can't exist without the 3 main parts, right? Okay, so the 3 main parts, and then the 3 parts that fall under those, which of course are the warrant, grounds, and I'm sorry, did I say warrant, grounds? I'm really tired. Okay, 3 main, data, claim, warrant. The 3 subcategories being, or subcomponents being, the rebuttal, the qualifier, and I believe that they call them grounds, that is extra support for the warrant. So, that was tough. I was visualizing it in my head. It was going to go smooth. Anyway, it's in your book, and it's a fairly easy explanation for how you might evaluate an argument, or the steps you should go through when you make an argument. Of course, we don't do that. We don't walk up to people and say, hey, it's a little bit before noon. Generally, people eat then at noon. My stomach is making a weird noise. I think because it's empty, I should probably put some food in it. So I'm going to go get lunch. Do you want to come with me if you are also having a grumbly? I mean, we don't go through all that. We're like, dude, Jeet yet? No? All right, let's go. I mean, that's like it, right? Because we don't talk in claim data warrant form. We talk, of course, as Aristotle said, in enthymematic form. That enthymeme, the idea of the most common argument being an enthymeme, where one or more of the premises are assumed to be true. If I say, did you eat yet? In Pittsburghese, it's Jeet yet? Did you eat yet? And you say no, that would prompt me to say, well, hey, I'm going to go get some food. Do you want to come with me? If you say yes, I might say, well, I'm going to go get some food. Do you want to come hang out with me for a little while? Implying, you don't have to eat in order to sit with me. And that's how we adjust our language, our requests, and our arguments as we go along. So that's sort of what Toulmin gave us that for. And it's not as flexible as it needs to be. I mean, let's just be fair. But and it is linear, and yes, it's paternalistic in some ways. So, it's dictatorial in some ways. Is that bad? I don't know. It's pretty clear, which is kind of nice. So that's Toulmin. Now, that actually brings up another guy around the same time as Toulmin, although I believe that he died at the age of 96-ish, back in 1993 or 94, and that is Kenneth Burke. Now, a lot of the people I worked with actually worked with Kenneth Burke. They were his student, or they listened to his lectures, or something along those lines. He was their mentor, etc. So a couple things to recognize about Burke. He was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He was Catholic. Needless to say, he and I relate a lot to each other. And a lot of people like to say, well, he was a postmodernist, but not really. I mean, the guy was very much about linear thought and about keeping to this idea of functional approaches to things. For example, the approach to a story, the approach to a narrative, the approach to a play. He was a literary critic. He was not a rhetorician. But he wrote a series of books, and there were supposed to be 3. And what we got is 2 of them completed. And the third one just sort of pops up in, pieces, articles. And then later from people who wrote after he died, who thought they knew what he was going to say. We have the grammar of motives, which came first. We have the rhetoric of motives, which came second. And then the third, I believe, was going to be a symbolic of motives, I think was the name of it. So what we have is, people, like I've said before, in the English department reading a grammar of motives, people in the communication department reading a rhetoric of motives, as if there's some difference between those two, but they're actually continuations of the same piece. It explains Burke's paradigm of dramatism, that everybody sees the world not in stories, but as a drama that's playing out, where we can determine the motives and why people do what they do, therefore why people say what they say. And the unfortunate thing is that the way he went about doing this was kind of interesting. I mean, really, it was a literary criticism, a psychoanalytic literary criticism, which was sort of rebellious at the time, of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. So imagine if I took a book, something as simple as the Twilight series, and wanted to criticize it and explain what it's really saying. Bella sets back feminism about 50 years. It's emotionally abusive of men in these, I could go on, right? And I could say all these things that people hate me for. That's what he did. And he never finished college. He went to college for months and decided he didn't like it. He went and he was basically taught by participating as an editor of The Dial, which was a literary magazine at the time, and he hung out with Kerouac, and he hung out with the poets on the beatniks in Greenwich Village in New York. He did all those things without a formal education, because he thought formal education would quash the sort of artistic or creative side of what he was doing. And when he wrote The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, his analysis of Mein Kampf, he was really treated as if he was a communist. And so all of a sudden, Red Scare, I mean, because this is in the 40s, you have the 60s, sorry. You have the Red Scare coming on, and you have people fearing that idea of communism, of Germany. I mean, World War II had just ended pretty much at that point. It felt like it wasn't that old, and people were still reeling from even the word German. Do you eat sauerkraut? Yeah, okay, you can go over there. I mean, it was bad, okay? It's hard to imagine living in that world, but based on the things that my grandparents have told me and the research I've done, our history is pretty clear on how we felt about things during the McCarthy era. So Burke was pretty much like sort of rejected. Now, there's another thing you need to know about Burke. At some point during all this, he divorced his wife and married her sister. And he had like 3 kids with each of them. So this was a case where your brother was your uncle or something along those lines. I can't do the math. My head would explode. Okay. And he was raised in wartime. He was raised in Pittsburgh. He ended up living in New Jersey after he went to New York. He settled with his family out in a house in New Jersey. He traveled all over the country because people brought him in to be a speaker, to talk about his literary theories and paradigm. He became very famous for things that were like the pentad, which is a very functional way of looking at the world, in case you didn't pick that up when you read The Grammar of Motives. And Burke really functions from a position of guilt. Everything is driven and motivated by guilt. Why would that be? I don't know. Maybe because he's a Catholic. That really drives home guilt. Okay. So if somebody says something to me like, I really don't like your glasses, I'm like, oh, dear God, what have I done? I'm a terrible person. We carry guilt very heavily, no matter what it is, like even in the most mundane things. And one of the things that I've done through my life is attempt to understand that guilt is not necessary. God doesn't ask for it. I don't know why the Catholic Church requires it except to keep us all in line. That seems to be the case. So the question becomes, what do you do with that guilt? And according to Burke, really there's 3 things that Burke is known for. The pentad is obviously the most, the most notable and the clearest to understand. It's a functional model of plug and play. There's the scene, there's the agent, there's the agency, etc. And you just plug it in, and then you see which 2 or 3 are the most functional or the most important to what it is that you're analyzing. And remember, he's talking about characters in a play. Like, he's trying to analyze literature, not human nature, although later on it became that. But he was so drunk by that point, most of us couldn't understand him. It's kind of interesting, actually. But he was brilliant, I think, up until probably the day he died. Just communicating that brilliance became very difficult sometime around the late 80s and early 90s. And so a lot of the stuff that we have from him is obviously prior to that. But the pentad is the most simplistic in the sense of understanding, and it's the most modern idea that he had, right? But his paradigm of dramatism doesn't stop with the pentad. That's not where this stops. There's another one called the guilt redemption cycle. And this is going to take us back to Hitler. The guilt redemption cycle is literally the idea that we walk around in a symbolic order that's created by language. I only yield power over someone who acknowledges that power and who treats me as if I have that power. Same thing with our presidency, and so on. Remember, I talked about the sociolinguistic way of looking at the world, that our language maintains our social institutions. So the president isn't the president unless we say he's the president, or she, whenever that happens. So what we end up with is creating our own world in this symbolic order. And Burke's very clear that there's an order. There is a hierarchy that exists out there. Now, I don't think that he was into the Catholic Church at this point and was saying, well, God's at the top. He was literally saying that when you're in any situation, doesn't matter which situation it is, and this is very neo-Aristotelian, when you're in any situation, you have to look at that situation, know who holds the cards, who's in power, who's making the decision, and then evaluate how to go about navigating that particular communication situation, that particular dramatic scene, if you will. Now, why do I say that the guilt redemption cycle is part of his criticism of Hitler? Well, that's very simple. So, without getting into the philosophy of why Catholics feel guilty all the time, although I could go on for hours, the fact of the matter is that Hitler wasn't Catholic. But what he does do, what Burke does do, is he basically tells us, and people aren't going to like this, and if you're really like bored and want to evaluate this, you can go read The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. It's an article that's available. I have a copy I can even send to you. I think it's in a PDF file. And there's links all over the place to it. The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle comes to the conclusion that Mein Kampf literally outlines what Hitler was going to do. That we were told when Mein Kampf was written, here's my outline for taking over the world. Now, at the time that Mein Kampf came out, nobody thought that. Hindsight's 20/20, I guess. Or, as Burke said, if we had just paid attention to the motivation behind what he was saying, we would have understood that he was going to kill a bunch of people. And so it's like, wow, how does that work? Well, this is where the guilt redemption cycle becomes important. He says that the first thing that we do is we violate the symbolic order in some way. And when we violate the symbolic order, we then spend time attempting to rejoin the order and put ourselves back into a place that's comfortable rather than uncomfortable. Because whenever you violate the symbolic order, you're uncomfortable. I mean, it could be anything from, oh my God, I failed that test, to why did Dr. Dudash use that tone with me today? Or to you literally broke the law, to you told your mom to shut up, whatever, take your pick. It could be big or small. I'm sorry, my phone's going off for some reason. It could be big or small, but in that moment, we need to rejoin the symbolic order, and some of that takes more work than other things. I mean, so how do you do that? How do you get to redemption? Well, the first step after you violate the order is to find out which way you want to sort of apologize or massage your way back into the order. And really this happens two ways. One way is victimization and scapegoating. You say, listen, I was victimized. That teacher gave us a trick test. Or Dudash hates my guts. I mean, take your pick, right? And then you're like, but so it's not my fault. It's the teacher's fault for the questions they asked. It's not my fault I got drunk and didn't study. It's her fault or his fault because I did not go and study like I was supposed to. I didn't produce what I was supposed to. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. You say, nope, it's all the professor's fault. Oftentimes when my mom and I get into an argument, I'm like, yeah, it's all her fault, obviously. But I think anybody who knows me knows that's probably not true, right? But we victimize and then we scapegoat others and we blame them for it. And then the other way that you might choose to go is mortification and transcendence. That is to say that you admit that you have done wrong. Yes, I screwed up. But that what you got out of it makes you such a better person that you transcend the violation enough that you don't need to worry about it. So you're like, well, this sounds like an apology, and in a way it is, but it's not the kind of apology that most people talk about. It's the kind of apology of rejoining the symbolic order. How can I get back to where I was? Tiger Woods never did. Bill Clinton did, and he did it in a very unique way, and I could talk to you about that another time. But as far as Hitler was concerned, Mein Kampf was the biggest victimization complaint and scapegoating that has ever happened, I believe. I mean, I don't say ancient civilizations, but at least in the modern eras, he literally said the reason that Germany is failing as a country and the reason that we are poor and broke and can't do anything is because of the Jewish people. Therefore, we must exterminate the Jewish people because they are dragging Germany down. And so he rallied around this victimization of don't let yourself be victimized anymore by a group that he's scapegoating, which in this case was people who were Jewish. It's such a simple thing that we might do on a daily basis, but on a mass scale. And that is how Hitler came to power. That is why the Holocaust happened. And of course, this was not a popular conversation piece for Burke, but it did get him attention. He sure as heck was very popular at that point in the sense that he was well known. So Burke writes this idea of why Hitler did what he did and why we should have known what he was going to do. But he writes it from a position of this idea of the guilt redemption cycle, that we all do this, that we violate the order and, we need to find our way back into the order. Now, you might be wondering how Hitler violated the order, and let me help you out with that. Essentially, he pushed his way into power. He was a little nobody, and he pushed his way into power and said, I'm going to overtake the government. That's an extreme violation of the symbolic order. So what do? You like, okay, here's why I did this. I had to do this for a reason. That reason is Jewish people, which makes no sense. But of course, if we look at it from the perspective of the guilt redemption cycle, it makes a ton of sense. Of course, you would pick somebody to blame. And we see it happen in our own country every day. I don't really want to get into that, but you can literally see Mein Kampf reoccur on a regular basis. And those people usually don't get into power because we've learned, but not always. So I'll let you let that go where it's going to go. So we have the pentad, we have the guilt redemption cycle. And then the other thing that we get from Burke is this idea of identification between you and the audience, or you and the person you're trying to influence. Okay. So in a book or in a play, you want people to identify with the characters or with the action or with the scene. I identify with Burke very closely. I'm not saying I like him or love him. I'm saying I identify a lot with him. I mean, we find people that we identify with who have done horrible things. That's not Burke either. But this doesn't mean that I think that Burke is the only one who's right. I'm just saying that I identify with him because I was also raised in Pittsburgh as a Catholic. And even though I was born in 1974 and he died in 1996, and I was really only around for a portion of his life that really I see in hindsight, we were at one point contemporary. That is to say, we were both on the earth at the same time. And Burke was born prior to World War I. Wait, when was he born? 1916, 1918. So like right around the time of World War I, he witnessed World War II. He witnessed all the wars up to 1992, which would have been the first the first Gulf War. So literally his entire life was spent in war. And he wanted to understand why that happened. And, wars start how? Keep thinking. They start with bombs or guns, injuries. They start with firepower. They start with some physical, material violation of the symbolic order, a coup, the killing of Ferdinand, Franz Ferdinand. I'm not really sure how true that is, but that's the story, right? So there is a physical manifestation of something that happens, and then we go to war and we kill each other. But how are wars solved? Well, they are solved with a piece of paper. They are solved with wars or words, excuse me. Wow. I'm not saying they solve the problem. I'm saying that it gets resolved, is what I should say. We stop wars with a treaty. Treaty of Versailles, treaty with the United Arab Emirates, whatever it is that we're signing, the treaty with the Palestinians and the Israelis. I mean, take your pick. We go back and forth all the time. We sign these treaties. We signed a treaty with France before we were even a country. I mean, it's just like there's, hey, we'll help you out if you'll help us out later. Okay. Too bad the guy who signed that treaty in France was dead at the time that we were supposed to do our side of things, but we didn't. We didn't hold up that treaty, that side of our treaty, because we didn't want to. Because by that point things had changed and we're like, dude, you guys fight your own war. We're going to sit here and try to establish our country because we just got out of the Revolutionary War, right? Like, we're divided by material things, but we are united by words. So in order to unite us, because we're all born separately, even twins, they are born separately. We're all born separate from each other in our minds. And our whole lives are about separation after that. Separation from our mom, separation from our mom and dad, separation from our siblings, and so on. In fact, we define ourselves in terms of how we are different from everybody else, right? That's how we define things. And so when I say that wall is blue, I'm not saying that wall is blue. I'm saying that wall is not purple. It's not plaid. It's not paisley. It's not pink. It's not red. It's not white. It's not black. It's not green. It's not yellow. You get the idea. I'm telling you what it's not. We don't define things as they are because no words actually define anything. They are arbitrary. So Burke really got us into that, which a lot of people call the theory of the negative. I call it the concept of the negative, that humans invented this idea of the no, the separation. Now, how do we get back? Well, through identification processes. We acknowledge each other on the planet. Think about it this way. You and I are walking down the hallway, and you run into me, and you say, hi, Dr. Dudash, and I just keep looking at my phone, right? How does that make you feel? Not great, right? Why doesn't that make you feel like, why are you not okay with that? I'm obviously busy. I probably didn't hear you, right? Well, the reason you're not okay with that is because all of us want to be acknowledged. And by me looking up and saying, hi, how are you? I am saying you are another human on this planet. I acknowledge your existence. You're acknowledging mine. We identify as fellow humans. We know that we have that in common, and we're in the same place at the same time. So obviously we have some other things in common. And this idea that we're constantly walking around trying to establish that, because we're constantly in a state of persuasion of trying to get others to be okay with who we are, to make sure that we're still existing in the symbolic order. So we're trying to establish what we call, what Burke calls common ground. We have shared common ideas at the surface level. And he says, we can persuade at that point on simple things, but I'm not going to change your values, your beliefs, or anything else unless I get to something called consubstantiality. What is consubstantiality? Consubstantiality is or con, which means with or together. Substance, meaning below the surface. Substance, meaning what the reasoning is underneath your particular beliefs, ideas, etc. And eality, obviously, process. So consubstantiality is really the process of finding where you and I share values that are more that are deeper in the ground, are rooted further down than just the common topsoil ground that we share, but that are actually deep enough that if I say something to you, I'm going to automatically persuade you because we are in the same, we're sharing the same substance at that point. And so you can see people all the time trying to convince you to do something, buy something. Why? Because you're human and you should. well, I'm a human, but I'm not like a superhuman, or I'm not an athletic human. So do I really need $300 Nike running shoes if I'm not ever going to go running? No. So those are for a very specific set of people. Identifying that audience is something that Perlman tells us is really, really important, and then making the argument from there. So all of these theorists sort of start to work together in your brain if you really think about it. So Burke, even though he's coming from a literary point of view, he's looking at literature, he's looking at poetics, he's looking at the aesthetic, and was not looking at necessarily political speeches. And for those of you who don't know, Mein Kampf is a book, not a political speech. So it's not like the political speech that made Hitler who he is. So it's a book. It's his journal, essentially. So he was interested in that, but somehow we've pulled him into this idea that, yeah, the world is a drama. We tell stories to make sense of the world. We have to get others to listen to us by sharing and identifying with them so that we can convince them that what we say is right. And that's how the theory of identification works. Now, normally I draw a big tree, talk about roots, common ground. The persuasion are the seeds of the tree that go out, and they can't grow and go out until the roots are really solid. It's a whole metaphor, but we're missing that because without the visual, it's not very fun, let me tell you. Now, you might think that Burke is a postmodernist because, you know, of this idea of, well, let's look at things as a story, not in a line of argument. But actually, if you think about like all these models, they're either linear or they're circular, which is nothing more than a line that's been pulled together. So he's still in that idea of the modern functional approach to things. A play, a story, a book, they have a particular way of going, especially at that time. You know, you establish the characters in the scene, you have a plot, it reaches a climax, and then it goes down to a conclusion. That's the way it's supposed to work, right? I mean, and Burke was still working from that assumption. Okay, make no mistake about it. I mean, Tarantino was not around yet. Pulp Fiction did not exist. Now, for those of you who don't understand that reference, Pulp Fiction, Memento, Mulholland Drive, I'm sure there's others that I'm not thinking of, but Pulp Fiction is the one that comes to mind. Pulp Fiction told you a story that starts with the end and then goes to the first part and then shows you the middle part last. And that's why a lot of people don't understand it. It's actually what we would call a 3-2-1, or not a 3-2-1, I'm sorry, a 2-1-3, a 3-1-2 structure, I believe. I believe it's a 3-1-2 structure. It might be a 2-1-3 structure, but I believe it's 3-1-2. And the reason I think it's 3-1-2 is because that's the Chicago area code. So I think that's why that happened the way it did. But anyway, the point is that he puts the story out of order on purpose to joggle your mind. I'm not really sure how that helps me in Pulp Fiction. It kind of doesn't. But it was a great experiment. It's certainly not the first postmodern work. Now, what do I mean by postmodern? How is that different from modern? Does it follow modern? And are we in postmodernism right now? All right, so the answer to those questions are yes, 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 no, yes. I'm just kidding. So modernism, if it's about clean lines, functionality, paternalism, linear thinking, etc., then what is postmodernism? Postmodernism is a reaction to modernism. It comes out of architecture, believe it or not, and art. It does not come from language or stories. It comes from architecture initially. That idea that we wanted beauty over comfort, or that we wanted to interrupt clean lines and mess with them a little bit. So instead of having straight lines and clean lines and corners and a very functional thing, we might make it not necessarily more ornate, but no, we would make it turn on top of itself. I'll give you an example. Falling Rock which is the house of Frank Lloyd Wright, which is just outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's his house. He built it, and he built it so that instead of a solid foundation and then, you build the house up in that way, instead of that, he has it like dangling on these formations, these rock formations, and there's a running waterfall creek-like thing, and he utilizes different angles to make this structure. It's literally balancing an entire structure on a point or a few points rather than on a square, linear sort of space or material. Same thing here. Have you ever seen, I find postmodern furniture to be very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. But that idea of interrupting the linear, interrupting the plot, interrupting the line or the circle that you think you're going in, getting rid of predictability and such. We could see it everywhere, not just in stuff like Frank Lloyd Wright's stuff. There's a building down at the University of Oklahoma that was built by a student of Frank Lloyd Wright, I believe. It looks like a big ship. I was in that building. I worked in that building for over a year. Terrible building, but it's still there. There is Picasso, who sort of takes apart the human face and disjoints it so that you can make sense out of it for yourself. There's obviously stories that are told this way. Great American novels were still told in linear chronological ways for the most part. Sometimes you might have them go back to a memory, but not in the same way that current literature or current movies or stories do. I mean, Mulholland Drive, Memento, brilliant. Don't get me wrong, Mulholland Drive I still don't understand. But Memento, brilliant, right? Because you have to go through what the character is going through in order to understand the motivation behind why he's doing the things that he's doing, the tattoos, the writings, etc. Right? The number, what was it? The number 3, whatever that movie was that Jim Carrey did. A Beautiful Mind is told in such a way that you don't know who's alive and who's dead. Literally went through the movie for the most part going, oh my God, all these people are alive? No. All dead? Nope. Some of them are real. Which ones are real? Trying to figure that out. It was really a good way to get into the minds of the audience to help them identify with what the character was going through. Unfortunately, when you become a rhetorical critic, you start figuring that stuff out much sooner than you wish you did. I remember a friend of mine took me to see The Sixth Sense, and I told her, I said, I don't like blood and gore. And at the time, I couldn't handle it. At the time, I could not handle blood and gore. Now I'm like, Exorcist? Sure, let's watch that. I watch a lot of gory things now. Not as much as my husband, but I do watch some. But we get in there, and we're sitting down, and we're about 10 minutes into the movie, and I went, Bruce Willis is dead. And she's like, just keep watching the movie, right? It was so obvious to me what, and by the way, if you haven't seen that movie, sorry to ruin it for you. But you should have caught up by now. So the character that Bruce Willis plays is dead. He's a ghost throughout the entire movie. And the trick is that people are like, what? And I'm like, dude, Haley Joel Osment at one point looks into the camera, looks into your eyes and says, I see dead people. They don't know that they're dead. He tells you. But yet people were tricked by the sort of outside things that were going on by interrupting that plot. So postmodernism disrupts the norm of what we expect. It disrupts progression of where we think we know what the end goal is going to be. Who uses that in rhetorical criticism? Some people would say nobody. Other people would say that critical theory is an extension of rhetorical criticism and rhetorical theory. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. I mean, yeah, I guess, kind of, sort of. So here's the deal. The first person that we really work with in the postmodern idea, the postmodern perspective, is another would have been contemporary. He died in 84, so I was 10, and that's Michel Foucault. And he was a French critic and a French psychologist and psychiatrist. He had PhDs in like everything. He was a gay man. He died of AIDS, but none of that informed his work, which is fantastic. And you can still watch videos of Michel Foucault. And wow, I'm trying to think of who the great pop critic is. He's still alive. He's American. They had translations. Wow, that's bad. YouTube, Michel, Michel Foucault, Foucault. And you will find these interviews or these exchanges between him and it's going to drive me nuts. As soon as I turn the stop button on, I know I'm going to think of it. But he used to have these debates because academic debates were considered important and good, and they would talk about society and how society controls us and how we need to know that it's controlling us. He wrote a book called The History The History of Sexuality? No, it's called An Archaeology of Knowledge. That's the one I want to go with. An Archaeology of Knowledge, where he goes back and he traces back how we learn about things and shows us that the way that we learn is dictating to us the meaning that those things have. For example, if you had been educated in the 60s and 50s like my parents were, you would have learned that being gay meant you were happy, that being queer meant that you didn't talk about it, that Uncle Bob is a permanent bachelor or whatever the hell they called it, and that they belong in a closet. And then when they started talking about, at the time, they used the word homosexuality as a not as a sin, because that's not working for anybody anymore, but as a medical problem, a mental illness. And what happens if we say something is a mental illness? That means that it can be fixed. It means there's a cure. It means that we need to put these people into hospitals. We need to isolate. We need to quarantine. We need to do all those things to these people because they need to be fixed. And that began the start of, hey, let's put electricity into these people's bodies until they become straight. Wow. I know you don't believe it, but it's true. It happened in my lifetime, and I'm not proud of that because, I didn't have a part in it. I was very young. But as I got older, even in the 90s, being gay in college was not considered cool at all. But, I had friends who, when we left college, they're like, hey, I just need to tell you before you leave, I'm gay. I'm like, yeah, okay, I knew that. It's not that hard for me to figure out, and it doesn't bother me. Being Catholic, being a Jesuit institution, being raised by a district attorney in, white bread, Pennsylvania, people just assume that I would be conservative. And so a lot of people were shy about telling me, hey, I'm gay. I'm like, that's nice. I'm glad you figured that out. We figured that out a long time ago. So, that idea that being queer, being gay, however they identify, is a mental illness, then put us into this cluster of talking about people who were queer, members of the LGBTQ community, as sick. And that allowed us to talk about curing them and putting them into hospitals. And that's it's a rhetorical construction, is what it is. And in case you can't see it in my eyes, I'm trying to think of the word that Foucault uses, but it's a rhetorical construction that allows the word, or allows the language that we use to allow, well, let's be honest, quite terrible things to happen to people, because we treat them as mentally ill. Therefore, we can take advantage of them, or they're less than human because they're Jewish, as in the case of Mein Kampf. Take your pick. So if that's what postmodernism is, if it's about interrupting the narrative, interrupting the larger narrative or small narratives, whatever, not just putting it in a different order, but interjecting something different. Now, if you watch Family Guy, that's one of the most postmodern pieces of art I've ever seen. I think Seth MacFarlane is a genius. I don't always appreciate the humor, but I appreciate the way that he goes about doing it. And most of the humor I do appreciate because they have these flashbacks and pop-ups to 80s references. And that's, of course, what my world is. Seth and I are about the same age. So I really identify with that. If you can follow it, it's hilarious. If you can't, it's not going to be funny to you. And so for people who don't have those references to the 80s, or people who don't have a way of understanding those interruptions in the plot, of which does not exist, by the way, they can't follow the story. They can't understand it. And if they can't understand it, then they're not going to get anything from it. They're not going to learn. You're not communicating. Boom. Everything's gone, which is what happens sometimes. And so Foucault's really talking about how dangerous that the idea of these clusters of learning can be. He also wrote a book on the history of sexuality. He wrote a book on prisons where he talks about sort of a big brother idea, but he talks about the panopticon, which is an all-seeing eye that we believe that we're all under. And therefore we function like our dads are watching us and they're going to come down and spank us at any moment for doing something bad or wrong. And so we won't run a red light, even if there's nobody around to tell us that we shouldn't have run the red light. That's silly, but we do it. This is why people draw a difference between law and ethics, because there's differences, right? So understanding the context of something becomes very important. So postmodernism says, that model only works in particular contexts, not in all contexts. Therefore, it's not as useful or as helpful. Postmodernism, therefore, says, you know what, though? It does create other things. For Foucault, it was the way that we learn harms other people. The history of the way we've taught sexuality harms other people. The way that we work with prisoners harms other people. And so what is he really looking at? And that's what critical theory is about. Critical theory is about power. That's it. It's about exposing power. I say that's it as if it's a small thing. It's a huge thing. And what do we get out of looking at things from a critical perspective? Well, we get a better understanding. We get an opportunity to try to find emancipation for ourselves. Because if I tell somebody that they need to be emancipated and here's how they go about doing it, I'm not emancipating them. I'm actually reifying their enslavement to the idea of a paternalistic, hammer coming down on them. And Foucault's very clear about this, by the way. In fact, he says critical theory is not an answer. It won't get you an answer. You're not going to get out of it. All you're going to be able to do is go, yeah, I'm oppressed. Here's how I'm oppressed. Now, people will come along and disagree with that and say, Foucault, you're wrong, because once you know, you can maneuver differently. If you think back to Christine de Pizan, she was like, hey, princesses, look at this. Look at what you can do within the confines of the power structure. Was it get out of the power structure? No, nobody can do that. But was it to do something different? Maybe a little bit. But by the time we get to Foucault and we get to Cixous and we get to Carlin Corse Campbell and we get to, well, less Carlin Corse Campbell, but that's a different conversation. But more people like Bell Hooks, they start saying things like, if you know that you're on the margin, then you should know how to move past and into and closer to a position of power for the sake of helping those on the margins. So this thing is 58 minutes long, and I feel like I rambled through some of it, but most of it feels like it's good content. Since I moved from Locke to the postmodern era, I'm going to feel pretty good about it. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to end this video. If you want me to give you a video on Foucault and Cixous and Carlin Corse Campbell and Bell Hooks, or anyone else, let me know and I will do that. It'll probably be more for your edification than anything else. Now, remember, if you need to turn your paper in late, that's fine. Just tell me so that when I do your grade, I don't give you an F. I just give you an incomplete. I'm totally cool with that. Just talk to me about it first. Well, tell me, okay? All right, I hope you guys are doing well. I haven't seen any questions or comments yet, so if I'm missing them, let me know. All right, I'll talk to you soon. Stay well.